Hello and welcome to The Top Story, the podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Qi Zhi. Coming up in this edition, Ukrainian officials have been meeting a U.S. delegation in Saudi Arabia to try to find a way to end the conflict with Russia. Israel's negotiating team has traveled to Qatar for talks aimed at extending the Gaza ceasefire. And the U.S. stocks plunged on Monday as uncertainties over tariffs and a possible federal government shutdown drove fears of a U.S. recession. We begin in Europe. Ukrainian and U.S. delegations have been meeting in Saudi Arabia to try to find a way to end the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Earlier, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Kyiv's position in Tuesday's talks with the U.S. will be constructive. Zelensky also expressed hope for practical outcomes from the negotiations. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has held separate talks with Zelensky and the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio in Jeddah. Nadia Swan has details.
Marco Rubio was speaking en route on his flight to Jeddah. He has now arrived in Jeddah ahead of those talks, and he sounded very, very positive indeed, and he said he was very hopeful about good outcomes from this round of talks between the Americans and the Ukrainians here in Jeddah. He talked about resolving a very important issue about the pause in U.S. military aid for Ukraine and also the pause in intelligence sharing with Ukraine as well, which has really been quite detrimental for them to prevent themselves from attacks against the Russians. He was also talking about dealing with both Ukraine and Russia and seeing where they are and what they want, talking about trying to find out whether both sides are prepared to actually make concessions and how far they're prepared to go to make those really difficult decisions to achieve what they refer to as a sustainable peace deal, in fact. The other thing that he was referring to as well was a rare minerals deal that was due to be signed a few weeks ago between the US and Ukraine. Now, that didn't happen after a rather acrimonious meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky in the Oval Office at the end of last month. So he said, with reference to that deal, there's a few more details to be worked out before that's actually likely to be signed. This is a chance for Ukraine to repair those damaged relationships with that damaged relationship with the United States after those Oval Office talks. So it's a way for President Zelensky to show that he is trying to improve that relationship moving forward. Now, there's also a critical need, as I said earlier, for them to actually resume military aid and intelligence sharing from the United States so they can defend themselves against Russia. So that is really, really important for the Ukrainians as well. That's what they're looking for. Additionally, they want an air and a sea ceasefire as well from the ongoing Russian attacks that are causing devastation in many Ukrainian cities. They're also looking for a prisoner exchange. Saudi Arabia was key to mediating a prisoner exchange over the last 3 years between Russia and Ukraine. So they're looking for another prisoner swap there. And finally, they're really wanting security guarantees against future Russian aggression. And that's so far to something that the US hasn't actually committed to doing, but that's really something that's very high on Ukraine's agenda.
That was Nadia Swan on international efforts at ending the conflict between Kyiv and Moscow. Staying in Europe, a tanker carrying jet fuel for the U.S. military has been hit by a container ship off northeast England. The cargo ship is reportedly loaded with highly toxic chemicals. The collision on Monday ignited fires on both vessels, causing multiple explosions and forcing both crews to abandon ship. Britain's Coast Guard said it has called off the search despite one crew member remaining missing. Li Jianhua has more from London.
The collision off the Yorkshire coast involved two vessels, the US-flagged fuel tanker Stena Immaculate and the Portuguese-flagged container ship Ceylon. Marine traffic data indicates that the 180-metre-long Stena Immaculate was anchored near Hull when it was struck by the 140-metre-long Ceylon. The US tanker, reportedly carrying jet fuel, had arrived from Greece and was waiting outside Hull, while the Ceylon was sailing from Scotland to the Netherlands. The owner of the American tanker confirmed that more than 20 crew members were on board and have been safely rescued. The alarm was first raised at 9:48 GMT, and by 10:20, the British Coast Guard had dispatched lifeboats and the rescue helicopter. Videos on social media show thick smoke billowing from the tanker, with reports of a massive fireball being seen. There are growing concerns over environmental damage, with the tanker's owner confirming that jet fuel has spilled into the North Sea. Greenpeace UK says the extent of the impact will depend on the quantity and type of fuel released. Authorities are continuing to assess the situation while investigations into the cause of the collision are underway.
That was Li Jianhua reporting from London. Moving on to the Middle East. Israel's negotiating team has travelled to Qatar for talks aimed at extending the Gaza ceasefire. The initial phase of the ceasefire ended on March the 1st. Hamas has been urging immediate negotiations on a second phase, while Israel has been pushing to extend phase 1. Jonathan Regev reports from Tel Aviv.
The delegation has been given a mandate to speak only about a possible extension of the first phase of the ceasefire. This is something that has been reportedly brought up by the United States, by U.S. Envoy Steve Witkoff, who will also be joining the talks in Doha, meaning extending the ceasefire for another month or so until the end of the holy Muslim month of Ramadan and the Jewish holiday of Passover. That will end roughly in mid-April, some 5 weeks from now or so. And so the delegation, the Israeli delegation, is meant to discuss that, extending that first phase for another 5 weeks or so. A ceasefire, of course, that would include the release of some Israeli hostages. The reports speak of roughly half of the 59 hostages remaining. Of course, there could be many details. How many living hostages will be released? How many dead hostages will be released? But that, according to the reports, is the mandate given to the delegation. Not anything past that. Not discussing the second phase of the ceasefire, which would include the complete withdrawal of the Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip and an announcement of the end of the war. On the other hand, this is exactly what Hamas is asking for, exactly that second phase. How do you narrow the gap between the demands of Israel and the demands by Hamas? The solutions should come from the Qataris, from the U.S., from the Egyptians, but at least according to what Israeli sources are hearing, nothing past the first phase. This is what the Israeli delegation will be speaking about, how much progress can be made when these are the circumstances. Again, not exactly clear.
That was Jonathan Regev in Tel Aviv. Meanwhile, Israel's decision to cut off electricity to Gaza has raised concern within the United Nations. Israel cut supply over the weekend to ramp up pressure on Hamas to release Israeli hostages. It follows Israel's ban last week on the entry of humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Rami Amagari has more on Gazans' response to the Israeli move.
Actually, this decision is viewed by the Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip as one more means of a pressure practiced by the Israeli government and Israeli authorities on the population of Gaza, on the Gaza Strip in general, because of the standoff over the ceasefire phases, the first phase, the second phase, the Israeli conflict, the Israeli-Hamas conflict over the either extension of the ceasefire deal as stated by Israel or going into a second phase of the deal. Actually, this decision will impact largely the population of the southern Gaza Strip, particularly 200,000 Palestinians in the south of the Deir al-Balah town in central Gaza Strip, because they used to get the desalinated water. And this was the only water plant operating in the Gaza Strip since over the past 4 months, since late 2024, when Israel was able to connect it with electricity based on or upon the request of UNICEF and other international organizations.
That was Rami Amagari on the plight of people in Gaza. Moving on to North America. In the United States, stocks plunged on Monday as uncertainties over tariffs and a possible federal government shutdown drove fears of a recession. The S&P 500 had its biggest one-day drop since December 18th, and the tech-loaded Nasdaq slid 4%, its biggest single-day drop since September 2022. Mitch McCann reports from New York.
After a volatile and troubling week for the US stock market last week, there wasn't much good news to report to begin the week on Monday in New York, with massive losses across the indices that we've been looking at. The Dow Jones fell a whopping 890 points on Monday. The S&P 500 was down 2.69%. And the Nasdaq was also down 4%. This is similar to what we saw last week, with widespread drops across the board. The question is, what's causing this and why has it happened? And the biggest reason perhaps is uncertainty over Donald Trump's on-again, off-again implementation of tariffs and the confusion that's causing, but also fears over a recession. Mr. Trump was asked in an interview by Fox News Business, which aired on Sunday night in the US, what are the prospects of a recession in the coming months here in the US? And he replied, I hate to predict things like that. There is a period of transition because what we're doing is very big. So instead of saying no, there's not going to be a recession, he said we are in a period of transition. Now, analysts at JP Morgan Chase, which is the largest banking company in the United States, said in a recent report that there was a, quote, materially higher risk of a global recession this year because of US policies. It's also been reported that strategists at Goldman Sachs say the chances of a recession this year are around 20%, and they've cited policy changes as a key risk.
That was Mitch McCann reporting. Turning to Africa, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, fighting between M23 rebels and the army continues to intensify in North Kivu province. The recent flare-up has left 11 people dead. Chris Okumringa has more on the situation in the DRC.
Fighting has continued in North Kivu province between the M23 rebels and government forces. We heard that the rebels have captured a village known as Nyabiondo. That is about 100 kilometers north of Goma. And this village, leads to a very strategic town known as Walikale that is rich in minerals like gold and coltan. And so there are fears that the rebels might get to that area and start exploiting the minerals. We have also heard that fighting has been continuing in another part of North Kivu province, an area known as Beni, where these Allied Democratic Forces, the ADF, have been wreaking havoc for almost 3 years now. We are told that the latest is that 11 people were killed over the weekend and their bodies were found in different parts of the area. Some of them were decapitated. The rebels also burnt houses of people and before they fled the scene. Government forces have said that they're pursuing them and they will do everything to hunt down the rebels. We also know that Ugandan troops are working jointly with Congolese forces under an operation dubbed Operation Shuja to hunt down the rebels, but the killings by the ADF have continued happening. So it's a very worrying security situation in the east of the DRC. The Congolese government is stretched dealing with the M23 rebels and the Allied Democratic Forces, and we're also hearing that some groups that were allied to the government, Wazalendo militia, have broken out and are also joining the M23 rebels. So it's a very tough situation for Congolese security officials.
That was Chris Okumringa on a sustained conflict in the DRC. Finally, in Asia, China has concluded its annual political season after the annual sessions of the top legislature and the top political advisory body ended in Beijing. At this year's two sessions, artificial intelligence took center stage. China is pledging more support for the sector as the global race for AI supremacy heats up. Mark New has more on the competitive global landscape that is increasingly dominated by Beijing and Washington.
In the competition to be the world's superpower in artificial intelligence, many analysts say two countries have extended their leads, while another region has fallen behind.
We are talking about something close to an arm race. Europe is in the third position behind the United States and China. They don't like it. And I know why. The reason for them to be in the third position because they created the restrictions on AI before they even have the AI.
All the companies around in Europe are like, what are you guys doing? Before this has started, you're starting to put regulations in place.
Dhiraj Pandey, CEO of AI company DevRev, is exchanging ideas with some of the top minds in AI at the Constellation AI Forum in Silicon Valley. He says although the U.S. and China lead the race, strong competitors will emerge.
I would foresee that there'll be another three countries, maybe three of the cities like Berlin and Bangalore, and maybe Sydney actually coming up with things that are highly innovative as well.
In fact, experts here at the forum point to the emergence of Chinese company DeepSeek as a major reason no one can be underestimated.
When we said, you're not going to get these chips to China, China's response is fine, and you're not going to get the chips from us. And so we also may have created a more competitive product for them because they were innovating something that could work on lower power chips.
Even though the AI debate is often framed as the U.S. versus China, experts don't necessarily agree that it will remain that way.
The best talent in the world is not in the U.S. That's the bottom line.
The best talent is in U.S.
It's not. It's nowhere near the U.S. The best talent in the West is not in the U.S. We're shutting down the doors. We're shutting down the doors of the country.
Who has the best talent?
Israel, China,
come on.
Nigeria.
And even within the U.S. and China markets, the competitive landscape is changing at a breakneck pace. On February 17th, Elon Musk's XAI released the chatbot Grok 3, which outdid GPT-4o in some coding benchmarks. But about 10 days later, OpenAI launched GPT 4.5, which claimed to be the first model that feels like talking to a thoughtful person. And DeepSeek's thunder is being stolen already, too. On Thursday, Alibaba launched QWQ-32B, which claims to have outperformed DeepSeek's R1 chatbot while consuming considerably less power.
That was Mark News speaking with industry insiders on the race for AI dominance. Now, a reminder of the headlines before we go. Ukrainian officials have been meeting a U.S. delegation in Saudi Arabia to try to find a way to end the conflict with Russia. Israel's negotiating team has traveled to Qatar for talks aimed at extending the Gaza ceasefire. And U.S. stocks have plunged as uncertainties over tariffs and a possible federal government shutdown drove fears of a recession. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a one-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Qi Zhi. Thank you for listening.